Joining me today is eminent pathologist, Dr. John Lee.
I think the problem with lockdowns throughout this whole period really has been that they're an untested therapy. And normally you don't roll out untested therapies without understanding what they're doing for the disease that you're rolling them out for, and also what the side effects are. And unfortunately, lockdowns were introduced almost globally, or in many, many countries globally, really without any consideration of those problems. So it seems to me that to have a sensible view on where we are with the virus and what the virus means and what we should be doing for the virus and so on, we need to think about three things. We need to think about the nature of the threat of the virus. How serious really is this virus? We need to think about the effectiveness of the measures that have been introduced, things like lockdowns and masks and all the other things that have been introduced. And we need to think about the costs of those measures. What are the downsides of lockdowns and masks and all the other things? And it does seem to me that over the period we've been talking about, the threat of the virus and the effectiveness of the measures have been systematically exaggerated, while the costs of the measures, the costs of lockdowns, the bad effects of lockdowns on people in all sorts of ways have been systematically underestimated. So when you put those things together, that's actually not a very nice picture. Some people have bought into the doom and gloom and catastrophe scenario of this virus more than others, and some scientists seem to have made a career out of being doom mongers. Really, I completely disagree with that assessment. I think the virus is a nasty virus. It certainly can kill people. Mainly it kills older people. Mainly it kills people who are already ill and unwell and possibly have limited life expectancy anyway. There's a spike every winter in respiratory infections. The question is, who dies of those respiratory infections? What's not unusual about COVID is that it affects old people more than middle-aged people and more than young people. And that's actually true of most diseases, not all diseases, but almost all diseases affect old people more. So if you get injured, if you get an infection, if you're talking about heart disease, if you're talking about cancer, if you're talking about pretty much most of the commonest diseases, they all affect older people more. And the reason is, as we get older, our bodies become less able to deal with all sorts of things that wear out in our bodies. And so it's part of the human condition, I'm afraid, that when we get to a certain age, parts of our bodies start to run down, including our immune systems, and that makes us more susceptible to diseases, and those diseases eventually will kill us. And the fact is, although lifespan has been increasing over the last century, the fact is that the vast majority of all of us will die in our 70s and our 80s. And one of the key figures about this whole last year is that the average age of death in the UK from all causes is 81 years and 2 months. The average age of death from COVID is 82 years and 4 months. In other words, 14 months older than the average age of death from all causes. So you can't really, from those two figures, make out COVID as being something that's this awful new plague that's going to kill us all, because it simply isn't. And I simply can't understand the rationale and the logic of closing down society almost completely when the main people it affects are the people who've got limited life expectancy anyway. And the question is, what is a disease that is so severe and so awful that it means that governments have to step in and tell us what we're allowed to do, who we're allowed to hug at Christmas, where we're allowed to go, who we're allowed to see, and what are diseases where we can make our own risk assessments and do our own, take our own activities on that basis. And COVID is in the latter group. COVID is a disease that was the severity of which was greatly overestimated at the beginning. So at the beginning, it was thought that maybe 3 or 4% of people, 3 or 4 in 100 people who got this disease would die of it. Now we know that that figure is much closer to 0.1 to 0.2%, which is much closer to other diseases that we have lived with for many years, like flu, which sometimes kills that number of people. So the idea that COVID is somehow exceptional is not true. Not only have we not had the cost-benefit analysis before the measures were introduced, but throughout this entire period, contrary views have essentially not been aired on mainstream media, which means it's very difficult when the public can't see people for one side and for another side debating issues. It's very difficult for the public to understand. And I have great sympathy with the public feeling either that they just really don't know what's going on, or that they don't believe what the government's telling them, but they don't know why, or that they do believe what the government's telling them because that's what you ought to be able to do. And things seem really, really awful. And I mean, basically, this is a problem with not airing the figures and the numbers properly. Science advances by vigorous debate, by people arguing about things. And when something like this happens, which is a new thing, it is a new virus, but we've never measured a virus in the way that we're measuring this one ever before, ever. No virus has ever been mass tested in real time like this virus is. So what those numbers mean and what the context of those numbers mean are things that's absolutely vital to discuss about in public, or people simply can't understand them. So when you hear the figure of 100,000 COVID deaths, remember that 100,000 COVID cases actually wasn't even COVID cases. It was people who died with COVID, which the government back in April, May last year made a big point of saying that deaths with were not the same as deaths because of. So, you can die with a positive test, but it may just be an incidental positive and you died of something else that was going to kill you anyway. But of course, in that 100,000 figure, those numbers have just been elided. They've been put together as if they're one and the same thing, which even the government agrees is not the case. So the way that this is being presented to the public is almost deliberately confusing, it seems to me, and is not helping people understand what's happening and what the best ways of going forward would be.